All right, here's our video cast. Lesson 2, Limits of Reform, Segregation, the reaction to things going on in the South and in the country. At this point in time, what were the limits of the progressive era? Two individual people we definitely need to know: Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Dubois, key leaders in the civil rights movement at this time. It is going on before our civil rights movement of the modern 20th century. This extends into the 20th century, but we need to compare and contrast their ideas and views on things. Make sure you take into context when they were born, when they lived. This guy first, this being Booker T. Washington, this one being W.E.B. Dubois. That's the context. The context is going to drive and help us understand the way they see things and the way they think. One here, Booker T, comes before the other, W.E.B. Dubois. They have different views about how to best achieve equality in the United States in this late 19th century. He's going to be a key founder of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, and Booker T. Washington here on the right is a key founder of the Tuskegee Institute, which is still around here yet today. How best to achieve equality in the United States? In our old textbook, you can see the page numbers there. According to Booker T. Washington, he has a specific view that is definitely rooted in his background and his upbringing. He's born a slave. He is self-educated. He's a founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, 1881. It's a technical skills trade kind of a school, how to be a construction worker or build houses, be a bricklayer, be a blacksmith, technical, industrial, blue-collar kind of skills like that, farming, agriculture, those things. He also was educated in a technical institute as well. These things being the product of the Freedmen's Bureau in the early days of the Reconstruction. And he really pitched the idea that we need to show and develop some economic power, use the skills and attack some trades and develop some skills that allow us to be economically successful. These are economic times. We're an economic country, and when we can show that we have some skills and we can support ourselves, then we will at some point in time be seen by whites and people in society as being equal and be given our civil rights over a period of time. He's going to found an organization called the National Negro Business League to help African Americans establish their own businesses, highly influential and still around here yet today. And again, the idea is we'll get equality when we get the education and skills to be seen as valuable. Do what you can right now. Don't push and be aggressive and scream and holler and protest for your rights. You got to show that you are a functional, self-supporting part of society. We've got to develop skills that we don't have in large part yet. And so that is his viewpoint. This will be challenged by W.E.B. Dubois later on, coming after him, and will very much disagree about this. He'll agree that we need skills, trades, abilities to support yourself. That is fine and good. Go out there and be useful and learn those skills and those trades, be a farmer, that kind of thing. But he feels it's not going to come fast enough, or it's too slow. It has to be pushed for. You can't sit and wait for somebody to give you civil liberties. He's going to be the first African American with a doctorate from Harvard University, so he's from the North. Booker T, more from the South, regional difference there as well, and context of what they were around and how they were educated a factor here as well. He helped start the Niagara Movement, which is a movement to fight race discrimination in the country in 1905, and he demanded and said we have to demand full political equality. We can't just depend on the economics of things. He's going to help form and be a founding member of the National Association of Colored People, still around and influential today, and it's going to be the organization that helps break down segregation through legal action, and that is his pitch and their pitch. Legal action has to be taken against discrimination. We have to demand on our rights now and push through government laws and legislation to make it happen. This is the only way we can escape slavery, because right now we are under economic slavery, and the black codes and the legislation of the South, the Jim Crow laws of the South, are keeping us in economic slavery. We're largely landless, and we are renting land from whites and in debt through debt peonage to whites, and that's keeping us in a bad spot. Even in the effort to try and become a part of the populist movement, poor white and black farmers joined that populist movement. They were very influential in drawing those people in. They were okay with the North, but in the South, those poor farmers and the populist movement in the South didn't want African Americans as a part of that, and they kept them separate. They were afraid that if African Americans got involved with this populist movement, they're going to push racist ideas, start breaking down, and it's breaking down the good system that is set up in the South in this post-Reconstruction time period, and win rights there. And so the populist movement kind of fell apart because there was this divide in the South versus the North and the West on race issues. The 15th Amendment of the Constitution, again, and like the 14th Amendment, is in power and in place, but it's not really being enforced. It's not being carried out. It is basically circumvented by loopholes we talked about before: poll taxes and literacy tests, the first of them being started in Mississippi and Louisiana. And this, of course, being something that also is a factor for economic disparity and educational disparity for whites as well. There's large numbers of poor whites and illiterate whites as well. To cover those people and to make sure they still voted, grandfather clauses were established, saying that if your ancestor could vote in 1860, actually that's the typo there, change that to 1860, not 67, you can vote too. You can see a sample test here. If you click on the PDF that's on the wiki, here's a sample of what it looks like in 1960. There were very long, detailed tests that you had to take and pass in order to become a voting citizen. Going back as well, post-Reconstruction time period, 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was the last legislation passed by the Radical Republican Congress of the Reconstruction era, basically was overturned, and the ruling in the Supreme Court was that the 14th Amendment prohibits states and the federal government from taking away people's life, liberty, and property, and the equal protection of the laws. Those things are protected at that level, but when it comes to private business organizations, it doesn't apply, so therefore segregation is okay. And that's what that Civil Rights Act of 1875 was, to stop segregation at the state or by state laws or by in the state government and federal government. But at the private level, businesses, industries, factories, buses, things like that, busing companies, it was legal. So here's where we have the expansion of Jim Crow laws, segregation laws really growing here, and states begin passing more and more of those laws. Plessy versus Ferguson, of course, we know that is the case that reaffirms separate is okay as long as it's equal, 1896. That is the rule at this point in time during our progressive era. It's not challenged. None of these laws are challenged during the progressive era. So the limits of progressivism really stop with economic and political changes for whites primarily, for the most part, obviously, here in the white world. But with the reality of things here, again, it's mostly, again, not in rural America that the changes are happening. Most of the changes are focusing on urban life for the most part, except when we get to the key, some of the key constitutional amendments. It doesn't do much for tenant migrant farmers, even for white tenant migrant farmers, but again, minorities are largely ignored. Lynching is rampant throughout the South in this time period, progressive era time period. A key individual in trying to push for, and a writer, an investigative writer, had her own paper reporting about the brutality in the South and throughout even the North. It could be found lynchings happening and civilians lynching people. It was something that was not being addressed, and it was something that kept people in their place, African Americans in their place, and pushing for lynch laws and writing about it was her thing, and she was very influential in getting the word out there, but yet nothing really ever happened. This particular flyer here, talking about the dire anti-lynching bill before the United States Senate. We'll talk later in the future why, one of the reasons geographically why this doesn't happen. Maybe you can get some support in the North for this, but in the South, you can definitely guess that it's not going to be supported in the South. But the statistics are huge. In terms of known lynchings, the numbers are very big, and we can find it throughout North and South. Especially in the South, we'll see and take a look at that a little bit more when we get to the 1920s, where we looked at the Ku Klux Klan again. Limits of progressivism, again, even at the presidential level, presidents did little for social justice and reforms. They didn't really push it. Teddy Roosevelt declined to allow Southern black delegates to be at his Progressive Party convention for fear of angering Southerners. Obviously, you might want to add that and annotate that. Taft started and Wilson finished off the continued separation of the races in federal offices, and they did this because they were afraid of angering white Southern progressives and hurting their position and reform efforts that they wanted to get done. So to keep the South and Southern progressives happy and keep them tied together to the movement, they do those things things to try and placate them. By 1916, we have basically year 2 of World War I, which we are not a part of yet in 1916, but we're focusing more on what's going on in World War I, and the reform spirit's starting to die out. But World War I has a major impact on 2 key pieces of legislation in our progressive era. One, prohibition happens because of this. It happens because they try to conserve as much energy and resources for the war effort as possible. This happens and goes into effect 1918, 1919, and so World War I puts this movement from a moral one, a Save America one, to win the war kind of a message, and so it becomes a nationwide law because of that constitutionally, and suffrage is for the same reasons as well. Women serve in factories and industries, and the right to vote politically happens because of that strong effort and strong showing of women in helping win the war, and it was almost unstoppable. There's no way to resist it at that time. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. So when the war is done, basically progressive era is done. It kills the movement, and people kind of want to get back to normal. They're sick and tired of change and reform, and we'll talk about that in the post-1920s time period. All right, so that is lesson 2. Make sure you do a good review and detailing of the difference between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Dubois, and we'll talk to you next time for lesson 3 to wrap up the progressive movement.